Hello, you're listening to the Charles Bonnet Syndrome Podcast. My name is Shaimond, and today's special guest is Dr. Marta Wnuczko. She holds a PhD from the University of Toronto with research that focuses on how both sighted and the blind perceive and navigate their environments. Currently, she is a professor of psychology at Humber Polytechnic, where she teaches psychology and behavioral economics. So how are you doing today, Dr. Marta?
I'm pretty good. How are you, Shaimond?
I'm doing really good. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I'm really grateful for this opportunity.
So can you tell the listeners a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, definitely. I am an experimental psychologist. I specialize in the study of how we perceive the natural environment with and without vision. That's my primary area of research. I also have pursued interests in behavioral economics, as you said, teaching this subject quite extensively at Humber Polytechnic, other institutions and universities as well. And I guess what I would like to highlight is my passion for application and just this constant quest to make psychology meaningful to personal lives and to real world problems. This is what I like to highlight in my research as well as teaching.
It's always good to have a passion for what you do, and the fact that you take up this field of study, and the mind is so vast and it does so much, and to be able to study certain parts of it or however that process is, I really appreciate that. Can you tell us a little bit about what an experimental psychologist is?
Yeah, of course. We can break it down a bit. So first of all, psychology itself is the study of human behavior and cognition. So here, cognition is just how we acquire knowledge and how we perceive the world. And experimental psychology in particular focuses on the scientific investigation of the processes underlying our experiences. And what we often do is, for example, observe behavior or people's interaction with the environment, and then based on that, we infer things about the hidden mental processes. What I could also mention is that the methods in experimental psychology are a little bit different, the goals as well, in comparison to, for example, clinical and counseling psychology. So when you think about clinical and counseling psychology, which I think could be of interest to many people here, these deal with diagnosis and treatment of different conditions, and the methods may include psychological assessments and interviews, etc. In experimental psychology, we are not concerned with diagnosis and treatment, but we do research that helps us better understand different experiences. And that can include, of course, conditions like, say, Charles Bonnet Syndrome or anything that could be of interest to us.
I'm glad that you actually brought up Charles Bonnet Syndrome, because I know you do have some experience with the condition. So can you tell me when you first found out about Charles Bonnet Syndrome?
I first heard about Charles Bonnet Syndrome when I was midway through my PhD. So my supervisor, Dr. John M. Kennedy, held weekly meetings, and sometimes we would invite guest speakers. And I remember one of those speakers was Ruth Bieber. I hope I'm not mispronouncing her name. She's an artist, and I think you've interviewed her on the podcast.
Yes, I have.
Had this absolutely fascinating story about how, despite being unable to physically see, she began experiencing colors and experiences that you would normally think are visual, but that didn't actually correspond to, as far as I remember, any actual physical objects. So I remember that we would try to figure out what might be the reason for it. And there was this hypothesis that perhaps this experience was triggered by the activity in the brain. And perhaps this was an example of Charles Bonnet Syndrome. So I found that very intriguing. And that's when I actually thought back to my experience with my great-grandmother. We've lived in this multi-generational home for many years, and my great-grandmother lived with us for about 10 years or so. And when she was in her 90s, she started losing her sight. And also she began experiencing all kinds of hallucinations. I remember she would tell us that she was seeing vivid, colorful flowers in the house, like near the mirror, for example. And they were not really there, but she would see flowers and also floating heads, which would make strange faces at her, she said. And she was not upset by these experiences. She was actually curious and amused, and she would tell us about them. It was something fascinating that was happening to her. And we responded also with curiosity, which I think was really helpful for her. That sort of helped her not to be afraid of that as well. It was like a reinforcement of a more curious approach to these experiences. So we knew she was hallucinating, but we also understood that this wasn't entirely unusual for someone losing sight at her age. And this was, of course, confirmed by doctors. And that was the personal experience that I could share.
I'm glad she felt comfortable talking to you, and I'm glad that you were able to make her feel comfortable. I'm glad you had that kind of relationship, because some people with CBS don't tell anybody because they're scared, because I think most people with CBS know that they're hallucinating. It has such a negative connotation, and you start thinking about Alzheimer's or schizophrenia or whatever the case may be, and you don't want to say anything. So with your grandmother, you knew she was hallucinating. What did your family think? Did they think it might be dementia? Because this is before you guys knew what Charles Bonnet Syndrome was.
Yes.
But obviously you made her comfortable enough to talk to you. So talk about that process.
Yes, we were actually not overly concerned because this did not seem to impact her emotionally. She was not upset about it. She was still very highly functioning. So she would often talk to us about everyday life, and she would remember our names, and it seemed like her memory was intact. Her reasoning was still intact. Obviously, she was older, so there was always some decline associated with old age, but she was really well adjusted. So apart from those hallucinations, it didn't seem like she was declining. And so I don't think we were very concerned about it. Obviously, we would have talked to doctors. I wasn't directly involved in that process, so my family may have known a lot more than I did. But I found it interesting that she was really fascinated, if anything, or amused by the experiences. And this kind of added some color to her daily experiences, which maybe were not as exciting as in the past because of some loss of mobility and vision and so on, which can be quite stressful. Of course, I do realize that not everyone with Charles Bonnet syndrome has positive experiences, so this was very uniquely her experience. But yes, to answer your question, we did not see this as a sign of dementia.
Okay. All right. It sounds like, I mean, you didn't actually say this, but this is what I'm getting. She was amused, so she wasn't frightened, and she was in her 90s, and you'd expect some things to happen in the 90s. And it sounds like a combination of that and some of the other factors that you mentioned made it a little more, maybe a better environment for her to feel comfortable to talk to the family. And then everybody's situation is different. Some people, no matter what they're going through, they can talk to their family, and some people feel that they can't.
Yes. And Shaimond, actually, I believe you mentioned a point in one of the earlier questions that people are often afraid of experiences like hallucinations, and they may not really want to talk about it. And there's the stigma associated with this because people often associate that with schizophrenia, etc. And although this is not my area of research, this is a topic that I definitely explored in literature surveys in preparation for my classes that I teach at Humber Polytechnic and at other institutions. And what I learned is that hallucinations actually are pretty common, right? People who do not experience any psychological clinical disorders still hallucinate sometimes. Especially I hear this is a pretty frequent occurrence at the verge of sleeping and waking. That moment when you fall asleep or when you wake up, for example, is the time when sometimes people hallucinate. So it may not be a frequent occurrence, but it's not as uncommon as people might think. This is perhaps something that could make people feel a little bit more comfortable with the experience and to encourage them to speak about it if that helps.
Yes, thanks for mentioning that. And some cultures actually treat something like hallucinations different or have different views on hallucinations. It seems like in America, it's a little more like don't talk about it as much, whereas in other cultures, it could be a little more accepted. But hopefully people like yourself and small things like this podcast and other things are changing that. So people feel more comfortable to talk about that.
Yes, I agree.
So you do a lot of research. Can you maybe talk about some of the studies that you've done or anything that you would like to highlight and let the audience know?
Yeah, in discussing my research, I definitely want to be mindful of the audience who may be particularly interested in vision loss and Charles Bonnet syndrome. So my work is not specifically on CBS, but I think it could offer some interesting implications for maybe raising awareness, especially instances where we become aware of an error or an illusion, or in the case of Charles Bonnet, a hallucination, right? This interplay between awareness and perception is really interesting. And one of the things we find is that even when we do become aware of errors of our perception, for example, that doesn't really change our perception. It can change our response to what we are experiencing, but the perception is still there. Now, more broadly speaking, if I can talk a little bit about my research, I look at behavior in information-rich environments that are highly textured and filled with lots of information. And it's interesting that sometimes we say that illusions or errors of perception happen when there's not a lot of information. But what we also find is that it also happens when the environment is rich in information, which is quite extraordinary and very surprising. So whether someone is sighted or blind, for example, we make a lot of systematic errors in how we perceive and interact with the world. There is some predictability to the kinds of errors, but nonetheless, they are there. And things like what we find in research is that both sighted and blind individuals tend to underestimate distance and misperceive angles and misperceive vantage points. And I can give a ton of different demonstrations of that. So one fun demonstration I often use is I ask someone to point to a previously seen or touched object, and then you can use a laser pointer or a long stick to see where exactly you're pointing. So what people are surprised to find, for instance, is that when we point with eyes open, we actually overshoot the target, and by a significant amount as well. Everyone is always shocked by that because we have this assumption that when we point with eyes open, we should be pointing in such a way that the laser dot will end up on the target itself. Actually, no, because of the geometry of pointing, we elevate the arm to a line of sight. And we are just unaware of that. And whenever I run this demo, people are just laughing. Anyone who's doing this is just surprised to see that when we point with eyes closed, we're actually closer to the object than when we point with eyes open. So there are lots of interesting, we study also with mirrors, the use of mirror images to perform a task, which is quite interesting. And also the use of perspective. What's interesting is that when we talk about perspective, and this is a big part of my research, this is, for example, this is the geometry of space where you, for example, stand in front of railroad tracks and they are parallel railroad tracks and they are projected to us as converging. That's linear perspective. So many people assume, oh, this is a visual phenomenon. And whenever I talk to participants, sighted or blind, they often assume that. But actually, no, what we say, this is information for depth perception, and it's actually available to you with or without vision. And no matter how many demos I do, people still find it very hard to accept this. Yes. So it's quite interesting to see this constant dance between becoming aware of errors, being surprised, and that's still not really necessarily changing the perception or changing one's views about what's actually true. It takes a long time for people to adjust that. But certainly, I think with awareness of how things arise, you can become more at ease, and you can also change the way you respond. You can train yourself to respond in a way perhaps that is more adaptive, that is more useful in a given circumstance. So those are some of the lessons from the research that I think have applications beyond this kind of narrow study of perception, which I would like to share here.
That's interesting. And I did speak to you a little bit before the podcast, and you were mentioning that basically some people will actually be aware of their hallucinations, but it doesn't necessarily change their perception of them, but it helps them learn how to respond to that. So can you maybe give an example of how someone can maybe have a hallucination, but just being aware that it is a hallucination, be able to change their perspective of that? Do you have any maybe tips or anything that you'd like to share?
The only personal example that I can share is from my great-grandmother, who experienced hallucinations regularly and often would see those hallucinations like talking to her. So it wasn't just visual, it was also like things coming at her, which I imagine can be quite shocking and stressful potentially.
Yes.
While I'm not a clinical psychologist, I believe I can provide some insights maybe or ideas about what could be helpful. I think that my great-grandmother, she coped with these hallucinations by not attaching too much significance to them. And I know this is anecdotal, but I imagine this could perhaps generalize to other instances as well. And we can consider this more broadly in discussions with others and through research. So when it came to my great-grandmother, she would talk to us about it. And I think it was this combination of awareness that, okay, this is just my brain creating hallucinations. And that awareness itself, I think, may have been helpful. And also the social interaction and the fact that there were people who said, yeah, it's okay, it's no big deal. That really helped her cope with this as well, quite well. So it's further reinforced the idea or her attitude of curiosity rather than fear. And I know not everyone has this opportunity. Sometimes people are among well-meaning individuals who simply are not well informed about the nature of hallucinations or how they arise. I think many people don't really know how they arise, that they are generated by the brain because of, say, sensory deficits, that maybe that there's some sort of a compensatory mechanism that leads to that. And there may be some stereotypes associated with hallucinations that are negative. So that's why sometimes expanding the network and including individuals who are going through similar experiences or people who are more informed about it can be quite useful potentially as well. That helps you see the situation as just a normal experience in a sense. So normal in the sense that there are reasons for it and it's not something personal and negative.
So you mentioned that you work with the sighted community and you work with the visually impaired community. When you start to think about what types of research you're going to do, how do you decide when you want to focus your research on the blind or visually impaired or on the sighted community?
That depends on the questions that I'm trying to answer and the problems that I'm trying to address more than anything else. Of course, there are some situational constraints as well, but just putting that aside, the first thing is like, what is it that you want to explore? So when I was studying at U of T, originally I pursued my PhD in the visual perception of space. And because it was about the visual perception of space, the target participants were people who are sighted. Later, as the research progressed and I would gain further insight into the underlying mechanisms of how, for example, we use perspective, I realized, there are some interesting studies we could also do about how information, like linear perspective, impacts non-visual perception of space. Over time, I realized that we can actually gain a lot more interesting findings by expanding the pool of participants to also include those who are blind. And this was important in testing new hypotheses about how we navigate or how we interact in very information-rich environments. And here, changes in angles, changes in direction, all of those things, those we would hypothesize are available to people who are sighted as well as people who are blind. So our natural environment provides a lot of information for the use of directions and angles, whether you are sighted or blind. And we found really interesting things, like we found, for example, that in pointing to previously touched or seen objects, people who are sighted and blind both point with similar levels of accuracy, which actually implies the use of linear perspective, which I think is surprising to some, but actually supports our original hypothesis. So back to your question, Shaimond, the way that we decide who will be our participants is very much tied to the problem of interest. Of course, the philosophy is also that you want to diversify your population of participants as much as possible to gain richer understanding of the underlying mechanisms of perception. So this definitely is one of the factors that pushes us to expand our horizons. And we do so over time as we gain more insights and understanding of whatever it is that we're studying.
So I understand that you're a professor at a university and you have done research and I believe still do research now. Mm-hmm. How do you split your time? How do you do that? How do you determine how much time you're going to be able to devote to research and how much you can devote to being a professor, or do the two kind of intermingle and you do the research with your students?
It's a difficult question how I decide to split the time between all of these. And especially now, right? The times are so tough and we often have a few things on the side and many people work multiple jobs. I'm also one of those individuals who have to do a number of different things at the same time. I am motivated very deeply by the desire to better understand the problems that are familiar to me, and realizing that really we do not have a lot of time. Life is short. I just have to keep going in all directions. And I don't know if that's necessarily a good advice. Always there are many people who say you shouldn't multitask. You should really focus on one thing at a time. I don't know how realistic this is these days. What I do actually, and this was an advice I received and I applied and I thought it was really useful, which is try to connect the different projects together. So this actually saves a lot of time. For instance, I'm interested in artificial intelligence in education. So right now I'm running studies as part of the courses that I do in behavioral economics. And so I'm both teaching and I'm also doing the research. I'm interested in all kinds of problems, like real world problems, like affordable housing, for instance. I'm passionate about that because I see this as a huge problem right now. And I know this is not really the subject of the podcast. I'm seeing this as a problem for regular citizens. I thought I would incorporate that into my courses. So we have these behavioral hackathons that are focused specifically on that. I worked for a while at OCAT with people who are visually impaired, and I was very deeply touched by their experiences. And I was personally moved by something. For instance, even this notion of linear perspective. How do I explain to someone linear perspective using tangible models? I built a model just for that purpose so that someone could see it. And then I turned this into the project, into a study, a research study. So it had multiple purposes. So building these nested projects is a way to save time and to really enrich the experience as much as possible. Do I still do multitasking and maybe spread myself too thin? I'm sure I do. And it's definitely an experience, a lesson that I'm still trying to master. I'm no different from anyone else here, but I'm trying my best. And I don't want to fall into the trap of not pursuing something because I don't have the time for it. If I see it as something valuable, I don't want to push it aside because I will probably end up never doing it. So that's what I keep in mind. Still trying to find the right balance between that and not spreading myself too thin, I suppose.
That's good advice. Thanks. And it's not easy and you're doing it. So thank you. It's always good to hear how someone is doing it, what their perspective is and what they do. Can people volunteer for your studies, or like how do you go about finding people for your research?
We use a combination of methods to get participants. One is by reaching out to different populations of participants. If I was to do research on people who are blind, I would probably reach out to different organizations for people who are blind, who support individuals with visual impairments. That's what I would usually do. But of course, I'm also very open to people reaching out to me, connecting to me via LinkedIn, or reaching out to me at maybe using my Humber email address. So it's my first name dot last name at humber.ca. Feel free to message me at any time and ask me about any opportunities for research.
Okay. And I'll actually put your email address in the show notes in case anyone would like to research you, because some people have reached out to me and say, hey, can I contact that person? And more often than not, everyone's comfortable with it. And I put the email address in the show notes. So I'll definitely do that. So Just in case there's someone that may have a visual impairment or something, would you mind verbally sharing your email address?
Yes, of course. So it's my first name, which is Marta dot my last name. So that's Wnuczko at humber.ca.
Okay.
So that's the email address that you can use to reach me regarding any research.
Okay, thanks for sharing that. You mentioned that people that are fully sighted and people that have a visual impairment often have problems, for lack of better words, with perception. Is there anything that you can speak about to maybe discuss how people can maybe improve their perception or improve the way they think about their perception?
So based on my personal experiences and maybe the surveys of literature and research that I've done to deepen my understanding of psychology when I prepare to teach my students, for example, and also maybe partly informed by research on errors in perception and how people deal with that, I find that just approaching it with curiosity could potentially be helpful. And also finding ways to reinforce positive attitudes by leveraging your social environment. And here you have to be careful, of course, again, even though people are well-meaning, some individuals may not necessarily positively influence you if they are scared of hallucinations or if they have some stereotypes attached to them. So if you're aware of that, expanding your network to include people who go through similar problems and talking to professionals like clinical psychologists or people who are very well aware and knowledgeable of or regarding probably even the most recent research on these topics is very helpful. Doing your own research, right? There are lots of wonderful articles. I usually like to look at multiple sources of information. That's one way to be objective about something and to better understand a topic, to gain a deeper understanding of the topic, is to like maybe read multiple articles about a given problem, like the maybe problem or phenomenon of hallucinations. Are they common? How common are they? And what is the reason? Why do they happen? This can be potentially useful, but I understand it's easier said than done. And I also understand that the hallucinations can be very scary because it seems like you don't have any control over them, right? They're not just intrusive thoughts, they're just something that happens that you have no control over. I think that can be quite frustrating and really scary sometimes. But I think there are wonderful resources sometimes from people experiencing these things and learning the lessons of coping with similar problems. Those individuals can be wonderful support as well, I imagine.
I was just thinking, because you said sometimes they can be scary, hallucinations.
Mm-hmm.
And I've probably said this before on the podcast, and I say this when I'm not on the podcast. Imagine if you have a bad dream, like a nightmare, you may experience a lot. Your heart may beat while you're sleeping, you may sweat. And then when you wake up, you can be scared maybe for a few minutes or even a few hours or a few days, depending on how severe it is. So it's like, how do you tell your body not to respond to what it's experiencing? And that's easier said than done. I've heard all sorts of people that react to their CBS in all different ways. That's really, you got to do what works for you ultimately, as long as it doesn't harm your body or harm anybody else. It's just what I'm thinking. I don't know if you have any insight into that. But it can be tough, and to have compassion as a caregiver or supporter or an advocate also.
Yes, and it's very possible that even if you get the best possible advice from professionals in this area and you get the best possible support, that doesn't necessarily change the emotions. So we spoke a lot about how awareness of hallucinations themselves will not necessarily change the perception of hallucinations. Like I assume this would be the case, as it is the case with illusions and errors of perception. They are still there. You can tell people about it. They still do it. They still engage in these errors, which is strange, perhaps in some ways, but that's the reality. But there's also this question of emotions, right? Can you actually reduce your anxiety and stress by becoming more aware? And we can hypothesize that in general, such awareness could diminish a negative response. But again, it's easier said than done, and emotions can be very powerful. And if you're experiencing something you have no control over and it's scary, maybe it's a scary visual image or a visual phenomenon, or not necessarily visual, just any hallucination that comes out of nowhere. It could be really scary. And those are very basic emotions that they happen at early stages of perception. So yeah, our reasoning and awareness and our kind of our metacognition, I want to say, being aware of your thoughts and so on. Those are more advanced cognitive processes. They kick in at some point, but they don't kick in right away. Like the first thing you experience is this fight, flight, or freeze response, for instance, if there's something scary. It happens first, and it takes a little while for you to get used to it and to respond perhaps with a more analytical and with a kinder way towards yourself. So the point is that the fearful responses, they happen early in the perception, early in the processing of information. It takes a while for these more advanced processes like analysis and understanding to come in and to perhaps override or influence those early emotional responses. So it takes a while, and it's okay to be scared, and it's a natural, normal process if you just think about how the information is processed within the human brain. That's how I see it based on literature and research I'm aware of.
Okay, so be patient. Give yourself some grace, be patient.
People with Charles Bonnet Syndrome, people who actually have this experience, lived experience of the syndrome, they can really contribute a lot of useful insights to research. Just because you don't have a PhD in psychology or you are not even perhaps very well educated doesn't mean that you cannot contribute something useful to research and to maybe come up with your own theories or explanations of how something might work based on your experience and your analysis of the problem. Definitely share that. And I think it's through communication and sharing of information that we can really progress. And that is definitely one of the aspects of scientific research, right? You want to share information, you want to talk about it and see if you can push the boundaries further.
So is there anything that you would like to discuss that maybe we haven't discussed yet, whether it's research or whatever it may be?
I hope, even though Charles Bonnet Syndrome is not my area of expertise, but I hope that some of my thoughts and ideas have been useful and interesting. And I guess the main message is that through teaching and research, I have found ways to break barriers, bust myths, reframe problems, approach life with curiosity, playfulness. And I think these are the kinds of approaches that I find add very interesting dimensions to our lives. And this is something that I would really love to see being done more often. In general, I don't think our society necessarily supports that fully, that sort of attitude. It's sometimes a little bit too rigid, I find, but whatever unique experiences we have, they enrich our lives in some ways, and they can really add a really interesting flavor to it and help us better understand the psychology of human beings and how we operate. And it can contribute to, I think, a better humanity in some sense.
Anything that we go through, good or bad, has a way of being useful or being helpful for us somehow, some way. Even if we don't realize it, then maybe 20 years later we'll look back and we'll say, man, if this didn't happen, I wouldn't have met this person in this support group. Or maybe it's been difficult for you, but you've enriched the lives of others because you became an advocate or you became something else where you were able to contribute in some way. And I don't wish this on anybody, but sometimes someone faces a tragedy, like maybe losing a family member or something, and they'll become an advocate and they'll go to Congress and they'll speak, or they'll start a nonprofit organization. Or
those are some of the most inspiring individuals.
Yeah. And it's like they just didn't want this person to die in vain. Yeah. And some of the best people that have been on the podcast and that help in the support groups that I attend and do some research and stuff are actually people that have CBS themselves. And it's nothing like someone that actually has that condition. You know, we all have to work together, but it's nothing like someone that actually is experiencing that. And even CBS is different for different people. And it's different one day than the next day. And one day you're doing good with it, and the next day you're having a bad day. But as long as we keep talking about it, we keep bringing awareness.
And I love this podcast that you created, this wonderful Charles Bonnet Syndrome Podcast, where you share insights and you help spread awareness through discussions of this with individuals who have it or individuals who study it. I mean, this is the most wonderful way to spread awareness. So I think that's very impactful.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thanks so much. And thanks for everything you do.
Thank you so much, Shaimond.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy the show, subscribe and rate the podcast. It makes a difference. And if you would like to contact me, you can email me at info@cbsyndromepodcast.com.